Good afternoon and Happy New Year, everyone. I want to welcome you all to our Academy of Political Science Forum. My name is Bob Shapiro. I'm president of the Academy of Political Science and a professor of political science and international and public affairs at Columbia University. These Academy forums have the purpose of showcasing the latest work published in the Academy's journal, Political Science Quarterly. And I have the pleasure of introducing the moderator of this esteemed panel, in a second. I just simply want to say that the article that we're going to be talking about today is literally hot off the printed press. It's been available on Early View for a while, but the printed issue of the journal came out today, and it's one of the leading articles in the journal. Our moderator today is Professor Marilena Mantis of Sacred Heart University, where she is a professor. She's also the managing editor and the associate editor of Political Science Quarterly, and I'm going to turn over the rest of the session to her. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shapiro. Welcome, everybody. We're happy to have everyone with us. Today's panel features an article that appears in the winter 2024 issue of Political Science Quarterly entitled "The Transatlantic Relationship and the Russia-Ukraine War." We have with us the authors of the article, Veronica Angel and Eric Jones. Professor Angel is an assistant professor at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute. Her research focuses on European integration and democracy building. Welcome, Professor Angel. And with us also is Professor Eric Jones. He's the director of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute, and he specializes in European integration and international political economy. Welcome. With us also, as you see on your screen, is our discussant, Dr. Paul Pillar. He retired in 2005 from a 28-year career in the U.S. intelligence community, in which his last position was National Intelligence Officer for the Near East and South Asia. Earlier, he served in a variety of analytical and managerial positions, including as chief of analytic units at the CIA, covering portions of the Near East, the Persian Gulf, and South Asia. His most recent book is Beyond the Water's Edge: How Partisanship Corrupts U.S. Foreign Policy. Welcome to all three of you. I'm delighted that you are here, and we are grateful for your time, and I know our participants are looking forward to hearing all of your comments. The forum will be structured as follows. We'll begin with a presentation of the article by the authors, followed by a discussion and comments by our discussant. We will then move on to a question and answer session. Members of the audience will have the opportunity to enter questions for our panelists directly in our chat. Please feel free to submit the questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Thank you all again. We are ready for our authors to begin.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Marlena, and thank you, Robert, for allowing us to present this work and also for supporting us over the number of years that it took for this article to come into publication. I mean, one of the things that I should say in introducing the work, in addition to giving you a little map of how we're going to present it, is that Veronica and I were developing this argument long before Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and we submitted the original version of the paper for consideration as a kind of longue durée examination of the transatlantic relationship, with no inkling that the transatlantic relationship would suddenly be galvanized by the need for solidarity in confrontation with Russian expansionism. And when that happened, the journal was very generous in giving us the time to wait and reflect on what we saw. And in the months and indeed years that followed, we were able to reassert our argument in a new framing that allowed us to try to explain why we did not believe that the united response that we saw to Russia's aggression would actually reactivate the transatlantic relationship in the form that we'd seen it in the past. And that new framing is what we're going to present. I'll give a quick overview of the article in the hopes that I can encourage many of you to read it, and then hand over to Veronica to explain why we think this argument is so important to make at this point in time. And we do that with great thanks to the journal, but also thank you so much, Paul, for agreeing to work with us It's tremendous for us to have somebody from the practitioner world actually reflect on the way we perceive things. I'm very curious to see if our perceptions and yours even approximately align. The argument that we make in the article is unfortunately a rather pessimistic one. There are structural gaps that have emerged in the context of the transatlantic relationship that are not insurmountable. They can be overcome with the strong political willingness on both sides of the Atlantic, and yet nevertheless they are not going to be overcome simply by dint of events. And the specific event that we point to is the Russia full-scale invasion of Ukraine. There are a number of proximate reasons why we do not think that Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine is going to reactivate the transatlantic relationship in an enduring manner. We spend a lot of time looking at the inconsistencies in European and American policies toward Russia, trying to underscore the extent to which the security perception of Russia has been different across the Atlantic, and much more important, the perception that Russia could be tamed through economic interaction was much more compelling on the European side, where Europeans perceive significant advantages to be received by purchasing relatively inexpensive Russian hydrocarbons, as opposed to the American side, where the concern for the vulnerabilities that this represented were always much greater. Now, obviously, there has been a decoupling of the energy economy from Europe to Russia. But you can even see today that this decoupling was not done with any great enthusiasm, that there remains a core community in Europe that would like to get access to those energy resources and would like to restart trade with Russia. And as they come to a situation where the war may find a negotiated solution, and hopefully a negotiated solution that has a lasting stabilization, the voices within Europe that will advocate a re-engagement with Russia will accelerate immediately, or that would be the argument that we would make. And this is true despite the efforts to impose a democracy versus autocracy framing, which is the second stage of our argument. Now, obviously, we could make the case that Russia it represents a different form of government and a tremendous challenge to democracy, and we can see that case not only in the article that we present, but in other arguments that could be made related to more current events. And the United States and the Biden administration has pushed very hard to generate a democracy versus autocracy framing that could unite the West behind support for Ukraine. The problem is that the conception of democracy and the operationalization of democracy on the two sides of Atlantic has subtle differences, and their ability to project a common vision of what democracy is and represents has been hampered by that. That's become even more apparent in the consistency with which they've engaged with democracies or non-democracies abroad. And the United States has engaged with non-democratic powers in other parts of the world in ways that make it hard for Europeans to embrace America's promotion of democracy as consistent with their own projection of European values. And crucially, the Europeans have done very similar things in the case of Russia, is only one illustration, embracing Russian hydrocarbons. So we can't get a common strategic view on Russia, and we can't get a common perception of the West as unified by democracy against non-democratic powers. What's really left to bind the transatlantic together, or the transatlantic couple together, in structural terms? And that argument is usually made with reference to economics. So we shift the paper away from these strategic considerations and begin to look at the argument for transatlantic economic interdependence as the basis for reshaping the debate about the transatlantic relationship, full stop. And the claim that we make in this part of the paper is that if we look at the case for cooperation across the Atlantic, the classic case that was made by Richard Cooper in The Economics of Interdependence, where he explained why the United States needs to structure cooperation with other powers if it's going to implement its economic policy instruments and achieve its own domestic political objectives. then what we can see is that progressively, this kind of economic cooperation has not been as robust as we would have expected it to be. And indeed, the economic cooperation across the Atlantic became, if anything, a bit more conflictive as we take the argument through the promotion of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. What we find is that efforts to bring the European and American economies together, rather than resulting in what the high-level Commission on Growth and Employment had expected, the low-hanging fruit of regulatory convergence and employment creation, actually generated significant conflict. And even though one might look at the Trump administration, the first Trump administration brought in 2016, as being responsible for getting rid of TTIP, a closer examination reveals that both the Europeans and the United States were going to have trouble getting that agreement ratified, even under the best of circumstances, and it's unlikely that it would have been complete. And deeper in the argument, what we argue is that there has been a subtle change in the way the United States uses the infrastructures of the global economy, infrastructures that have been put into place progressively as part of this Western agreement at the end of the Second World War, begins to use the infrastructures to offset the loss of political power that has resulted from the transfer of economic activity from the West to the emerging markets of the global economy. And so we look through the argument made by Henry Farrell and Abraham Newman, the argument about the weaponization of interdependence, to explore how attempts by successive administrations, starting with George W. Bush, going through Barack Obama, into Donald Trump and Joe Biden, how efforts by successive administrations to leverage these global market infrastructures have actually begun to alienate our partners across the Atlantic, and to create a whole discourse in Europe on strategic autonomy that is really about strategic autonomy from the United States. This also applies in the more advanced digital parts of the economy for reasons that I would elaborate in question and answer. I think we can see both aspects on full display as the Trump administration is coming back into office. And so there's a fundamental tension that that is emerging in the use of these economic instruments, and that tension is grounded in the need for domestic legitimacy. And this is the last step in the argument. As we look at the Biden administration and the efforts to promote a foreign policy for the middle class, what we recognize is that both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat, recognize that the globalized world economy wasn't providing what the working class needs. And in that context, what they were worried about was trying to find ways to appease that working class and to bring it back into the post-war construct. Europeans were doing very much the same thing, but the way they were doing it across the Atlantic was incompatible in many respects. And that incompatibility represented another structural form of irritation. Now, again, our conclusion is that these structural problems that we identify are not necessarily fatal, but it would take significant political will to overcome them, to harmonize the way we deal with Russia, to think in more coherent fashion about what it means to be a West and how we engage in a kind of global leadership, how we manage our economic interdependence, and how we do so in a way without sacrificing the legitimacy that we need in the domestic political context. And the reason that we believe that it's important for us to generate that political will are what my colleague Veronica Angel will describe in the last part of our presentation. Thank you.
I will focus on three main implications of this pessimistic scenario. And I also think that these are potential hypotheses for future studies, some of which we have already started ourselves. So first of all, this incoherent vision of the transatlantic partnership weakens Western leadership. It encourages alternative world orders. And lastly, it increases the likelihood of conflict in a fragmented order. So first of all, the erosion of the coherent vision and its implications for Western leadership. Without this shared vision of Western interests, the partnership risks becoming insufficient for enduring leadership altogether. So we have these structural and emotional ties that we refer to also in the paper, which are very important, but they cannot sustain a partnership that remains focused mostly on crisis management and crisis response rather than some broader strategic objectives. And this incoherence undermines the capacity to present a united front in global governance and leadership, to the extent that there is still an interest to have Western leadership in this current era. And one dimension where we will see that incoherence at work in 2025, and we can talk more during the Q&A, is as the incoming US administration is likely to pressure Ukraine into a ceasefire that is favorable to Russia, and thus pose an immediate threat to the European Union and to NATO's Eastern Front, and by implication to NATO more generally. Second, the encouragement of alternative world orders. The incoherence, again, of this Western alliance nurtures aspirations for a more transactional world order, especially among non-Western nations that in their own right seek prosperity, they seek security, but they also seek a much more pragmatic cooperation without the adherence to Western ideological frameworks or hegemony. Again, there's always a question the extent to which that kind of hegemony is legitimate, but this is a different kind of an inquiry. This shift reflects a growing disinterest in maintaining transatlantic solidarity and really fosters, we claim, a global environment that is less constrained by shared norms, that is more difficult to understand even, and that doesn't really pay attention to multilateral rules. And this happens at the same time when other regional powers, let's say like Russia, or emerging global powers like China, seek to impose their own world order view. And finally, why do we say that this leads to an increased likelihood of conflict? Well, the lack of clear and effective guidelines for managing power politics or for resolving conflicts peacefully definitely exacerbates global instability. It almost goes without saying. The weakening of the Transatlantic Alliance contributes to conditions that are more conducive to large-scale violent conflicts as the global order shifts towards economic distrust, as Eric referred to, or retaliatory policies rather than multilateral cooperation. And here, perhaps, it's also interesting to discuss why the inclusion of Greenland in the United States would be something that is different from the fact that Greenland, administered by Denmark, is already in the pool of friends for the United States as NATO members as well. So the implications of our argument are, we argue, even more salient in the context of a Trump victory in the United States. And regardless of where our politics is, it shouldn't affect our ability to see where policy is going, right? And the argument in our paper, we believe, is amplified. The dynamics that we describe are amplified by the kind of policy that we see coming from the United States. Final point here would be that to test the cooperation, the space for cooperation between the United States and the EU in foreign policy, we have launched an expert survey, a pan-European expert survey in collaboration with the Council on Foreign Affairs in the United States to see whether experts agree on the sources of global risk for the kind of interests that the two transatlantic partners might have. And the results of our inquiry will be coming out soon, in about 2 weeks. If anyone is interested in seeing where we take this research from here, please just send us a note and we will share those results. with you as well. I would leave it here and hopefully get more questions on any of these points in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. Thank you, Eric. Thank you very much for that presentation of the paper. We're going to move on to our discussant now, but I want to quickly remind members of our audience that if you wish to submit a question, but for any of the panelists, please use the Q&A feature at the very bottom of your screen. We're ready for your comments, Dr. Pillar.
Okay, thank you, Marilena. I commend the authors for a very well-researched article that addresses some front burner issues that are going to be very much on the front burner in the months and years ahead. The overall argument of the piece, namely that the burst of apparent solidarity and enthusiasm for collective action in the Western alliance that followed Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that it should not be read as overcoming the many factors that tend to undermine transatlantic collective action generally. That overall argument, I think, is certainly sound and very well supported. I agree with it. The main structure of the argument is a US versus Europe framework. And of the issues that the article addresses, I think the one that fits most neatly into that framework concerns the weaponization of financial interdependence because of the special role of the US dollar in international trade and finance, which successive US administrations of both parties seem intent on weaponizing, despite this being, as the authors correctly note in the article, a wasting asset. In some other respects, as the article points out, the main problem isn't so much a transatlantic divide, but simply that policymakers on neither side of the Atlantic have gotten their acts together. And then in still other respects, and this is where I'm going to focus my comments, the divisions within the United States or within Europe are in many ways at least as relevant to how these issues are handled or mishandled as transatlantic divisions are. Now, the article gets into these divisions in various places, especially on the European side, but I think one can go even farther in relating some of these foreign policy issues to domestic politics in terms of partisan competition and even the role of individual leaders. This is perhaps most apparent with regard to policy toward Russia. US policy on that topic, as of 4 years ago, and now beginning again in another 11 days, is in large part an epiphenomenon of Donald Trump's peculiar relationship with Russia and Vladimir Putin. The roots and nature of that relationship being not fully examined, with domestic politics being the reason why it hasn't been fully examined. So it's partly a matter of one man and not even just one political party that we're talking about. In fact, Trump has managed to turn around what had been the traditional Republican Party firm line toward Moscow, going back through the Cold War years when we were talking about the Soviet Union rather than the Russian Federation. This shows up in opinion polls in which self-identified Republicans, pre-Trump, reflected a relatively hard line toward Moscow, a line which became, in the polls among the self-identified Republicans, a much softer one once Trump came into the picture and became the head of the party and took the positions he did and says the things he says about Putin and Russia. What we are seeing happen is simply political tribalism, the adherents of a party taking their cues from the party's leadership. This, by the way, is in contrast to a pattern that's described in another article in the current issue of the Quarterly, an article by Robert Erickson that talks about the abortion issue and how Americans quite easily can form very strong opinions about that issue, which tend to then generate their party affiliations rather than the party affiliation determining their position on that issue. And as Erickson's article makes clear, the abortion issue is rather unusual in that respect, in that it's an easy issue for people to form very strong personal opinions about without being told what they should believe by their party leadership. Most other issues aren't that way. And certainly the foreign policy issues that we're talking about today are not at all like that. It is much more a matter of the rank and file taking their cues from the leadership, and the leadership right now on the Republican side is Donald Trump. The Ukraine half, as well as the Russia half of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, also ties back to domestic US politics involving Trump. If we recall the 2020 election campaign in which Trump tried to use a withholding of military aid as leverage to try to get the Ukrainian president to dig up dirt on Trump's domestic opponent, as well as the false accusations about Joe Biden's posture regarding corruption in Ukraine. One bottom line consequence of all this is what I would describe as the mercurial nature of US policy and what it's become if you take a frame of reference of several years. Not only is it not any part of fixed difference of views that can be understood primarily along US versus Europe lines, it's even less of a constant than some of the intra-European differences on policy toward Russia, which the article correctly describes as based on factors such as the Eastern Europeans' more immediate security concerns about Russia for geographic reasons than Western Europeans, as well as the various differences in the past about dependence on Russian energy exports. Now, there's a further influence on policy toward Russia that involves domestic politics, and that is the admiration among many in the right-wing faux populist world for what we can call the anti-woke qualities of Putin's regime in Russia. This characterizes not only most of Trump's constituency in the United States, but also, as the article mentions, parties such as the AfD in Germany, the National Rally in France, the Freedom Party in Austria, which seems to be on the verge of taking over the chancellorship in that country, as well as Orban's regime in Hungary. For each of these entities on both sides of the Atlantic, it's largely a matter of projecting onto a question of foreign policy, that is to say, policy toward Russia, what each of these leaders or parties would like to see in their own domestic societies when it comes to immigration and all the other things that come under the anti-woke label. This can be viewed as a transnational phenomenon that has helped shape attitudes and policies on the issues under discussion. And I'd say that's another alternative to thinking about some of these issues in a strictly US versus Europe framework. One brief mention about the democratization issue. And as the article suggests, on both the US and the European side, there's been a lot of hypocrisy involved when it comes to shaping relations with democratic and authoritarian regimes. But I would bring in one domestic politics angle again. Part of the reason for Joe Biden's emphasis on the theme of democratization and the big international conference he held a couple of years ago and so on, and I'm not questioning his sincerity on the topic, but I think much of the motivation still is, the threat to democracy in the United States, as posed by Trump and his rejection of democratic norms. I'm not saying, this all started with Joe Biden. Obviously, it didn't. When you go back to George W. Bush at the time of the Iraq War, as of the beginning of his second term, then we were hearing a lot about democratization as the main motivation or at least rationale for that war. But I think, again, the domestic political side of it, more so than transatlantic ideological differences, I think are the key to understanding what generates some of these policies. Well, one closing comment. If incoming President Trump does even half of what he has said he will do regarding trade and tariffs, then genuine transatlantic tensions on economic issues will intensify even beyond what they've been so far and what is described in the article. And in a way that will add to the conflicts and to the lack of common purpose within the Western world that are the main subjects of the paper. And that's in addition to all the other things that we're reading about lately about demands for 5% of GNP expenditures on defense and what's the future of Greenland and all that. So I think the timeliness of this article is better than ever with regard to what we're facing in the Transatlantic Alliance over the next 4 years. But again, my compliments on a very good piece. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments and for highlighting the timeliness of the piece, a piece that has had a long history with our journal. And we're delighted that we're able to hold the event that we're holding today at the time that we're holding it, because this in many respects becomes again now kind of an opportunity to reflect even further on the conclusions made in that piece. And I'm glad that you all started having that discussion. Just a quick reminder to our audience to use the Q&A feature to pose questions to the panelists. And I'd like now to give an opportunity to the authors to respond further. And for the three of you to feel free to engage in additional discussion as you see fit based on kind of your own responses to the comments made by our discussants.
I'm gonna abuse the fact that it went first the first time to do it again. Paul, thank you so much for your comments. I'm very grateful, and you've actually hit on the core of where our research agenda has been moving, which is the way domestic politics on both sides of the Atlantic is actually confounding what we're trying to do across the Atlantic. And I want to push this argument that you suggest, which I think is a really powerful one, about the fact that it's not just a competition of domestic self-interest, but it's this kind of mimetic, affinitive politics where people domestically see in other countries the values they would like to promote, and so translate that into a foreign policy affinity for other countries, even if they dislike what those other countries are doing in proximate terms. And I would suggest to take that just one step further. It allows them to embrace interpretations of what those other countries are doing that they otherwise would dislike in ways that paradoxically, make it excusable in the way John Mearsheimer's view of the West being responsible somehow for Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been embraced by certain right-wing communities that admire Russia's anti-woke agenda, and then grab that other narrative framing in order to excuse Russia's bad behavior. I think it's a very powerful aspect of the domestic foreign policy nexus that we're going to have to deal with. So I'm so glad you point that out and give us the excuse to think of ways that we could embrace that. I think it also applies in other parts of the world. And Paul, it would be interesting to get your reflections in the Middle East on this, because the contrast, which we do not pick up in the paper because of when it was written and published, the contrast between Europe and the United States response to Israel's response to the 7th of October, the terrible attacks that Hamas imposed on Israeli society. The way the rest of the world puts that against what happened in Ukraine is creating a whole other narrative problem for the United States and for Europe, on top of the narrative problem that we suggest in the Ukrainian context. So I take all of this very much into account, and it's clear that not just we, but everyone on this call has a lot of work to do in understanding where our foreign policy is headed. But that's just a long way of saying thank you, Paul.
Well, Eric, you mentioned, the Middle East. I abstained from that in my other comments. I was almost going to ask you and Veronica for how you see your frame of reference of being applied to the Middle East issues. I would just say that given the way the U.S. election came out, and that it is Trump who's going to be the president for the next 4 years, and not Kamala Harris, I think the Middle East will increasingly be a very sore point in transatlantic relations. And I don't see any of the trends over the last year, which have included increasing questioning about what Israel is doing, questions that are less politically constrained in some European contexts than they are in the United States. I would point to the very recent Irish government's joining of the suit before the International Court of Justice, which actually modified and added to the South African suit in some very interesting and, in my view, useful ways, in ways that aren't part of the even permitted discussion here in the United States. So I think this will be a focus of increased transatlantic tensions, in addition to all the economic and Russia-related things that you mentioned.
I want to add that absolutely, as authors, we can't but be delighted by the salience of our argument and that it comes out at the right time. As citizens, as transatlantic citizens, it's all terrible news. And one of the comments that I find very interesting from also researchers' point of view that Paul made is this aspect about the role of elites in cueing foreign policy preferences. And this is another part of our research agenda that finds motivation in this initial research in trying to see exactly how experts who are more imbued into the policymaking world in the EU as well as in the United States see the source of threats coming towards either the United States or in Europe, and whether these threats or perceptions of threats align. We did that exactly because we imagine that in foreign policy, although people can have strong, and we have some evidence in literature that people have strong preferences, attitudes towards certain issues, these are mostly cued by political elites. And it matters very much what these aligned extreme right nationalists view politicians that have taken over some of the politics in the European Union and also in the United States, what they want to do in foreign policy as well. And unfortunately, it's very predictable. And even if paradoxically they are transnationally aligned, they remain a nationalist. And at some point, their different interests will clash. So at least in that sense, our argument, I would say, would remain valid, even if we end up seeing a Trump, Orban, Meloni alignment in not supporting Ukraine, for example. They will clash at some point, and that will only create more disorder and more incoherence. So Eric wanted to end his presentation, I think, on a happy note by saying that all is not lost. There is space if there is will. But I think that Paul really grounded us much better at this point to say that that will is not likely to be there. And so we are probably going to see an amplification of this mechanism at work, which, again, great news for the authors, bad news for the transatlantic citizens that we are.
Thank you, Veronica. Thank you, everyone. We have a couple of questions from our audience that I'd like to share with you. I'll read the questions, and you could feel free to weigh in and answer in whatever order you like. The first one, in light of the ruinous Washington consensus towards trade with the EU, is it possible to concentrate instead on common foreign policy objectives, realizing that the EU needs some restructuring of its voting rights towards the shared foreign policy goals that most EU nations share, while also encouraging the vital importance of foreign policy objectives that conceivably could realign the Atlantic Partnership?
Veronica, do you want to talk about the sharing of foreign policy goals? I mean, my comment on the ruinous Washington consensus toward trade with the EU, I think the two things that I would distinguish between are the Washington consensus, which was really more about capital market liberalization and the fiscal policy implications, has been ruinous, but it wasn't necessarily directed toward trade. and it has had significant implications for the way we understand how the economy works. And the most important of those implications has been to ask people or force people to reconsider whether globalization is a good thing. And is it a good thing in security terms, and is it a good thing in domestic economic terms? There's a brilliant book by Peter Goodman called How the World Ran Out of Everything, that provides a critique of globalization that is very consistent with what the Biden administration was pursuing as its foreign policy for the middle class, and what the European Union has now outlined in the combination of the report by Enrico Letta and Mario Draghi. And what I would argue is that there is the basis for a common policy there across the Atlantic. It will look very different from the common policy that we saw at the end of the Second World War and that we saw in the Washington Consensus at the start of the 1990s. But I'll leave over to Veronica to talk about the foreign policy objectives in voting, because that's exactly where she's been leading this most recent research project.
Yes, this gives us the opportunity to preview a little bit of the main takeaways from this very specific study that we conducted, which was looking to answer this question in a descriptive way. So we wanted, as I said, to see if experts view conflicts and the likelihood and the impact of global conflicts similarly on US interests and on EU interests. And we saw that there is a significant space for alignment, according to the great number of experts that we surveyed in the EU and the CFR in the US. And primarily, we can see that the experts agree that the ceasefire on Russia's terms in Ukraine is a top threat to interests on both sides of the Atlantic. And experts also agree that there is the possibility for Russian military action in non-NATO neighboring states. You can see on both sides of the Atlantic that there is space to acknowledge that hybrid warfare looms very clearly on the horizon, and that both sides have to brace for critical infrastructure attacks in the coming year as well. There is definitely a certain level of agreement also that there will be no peace in the Middle East, and that will have strong effects on US interests and on EU interests. So in that sense, the space for collaboration is there, and experts would agree. There are also other different aspects of foreign policy that are more salient to the United States, of course, and to the European Union. But again, the problem here, and that Denise's question points us to a pessimistic scenario, because there is no clear political will at the level of the elites to work together towards finding these kind of foreign policy objectives as a joint project. And this is not, as we argue, not only the outcome of current administrations, but it's a long-term movement in this direction, which makes it even more challenging to try to solve. So unfortunately, yeah, there isn't really. It's a nuanced answer. There is space for collaboration, but there isn't really a will to do so.
One thing I would add is that on security-related issues, part of this is the question of the role of NATO, which is of course, the institutionalization of transatlantic security cooperation. NATO, long ago, as we know, went out of area to do things in Afghanistan and elsewhere. But I think it's still a very open issue, what the US and the European allies collectively want and to make and should make out of NATO, not only with regard to the question of Ukraine and how that comes up occasionally about NATO membership and whether ruling it out is going to be part of some peace agreement in Ukraine, but also, future Bosnias and future Afghanistans and so on. So it's an institutional issue vis-a-vis NATO, as well as all the substance involved on security, as well as economic issues.
If I could also add one point here that I think it's interesting to look into, is that there's also a lot of misunderstanding in this relationship. Eric and I were also doing field work in Ukraine, in Kyiv, and we spoke to policymakers there and to some of the people that are members of the civil society that are closely watching the effects of this pressure for a ceasefire under any conditions. And I think that one of our conclusions was that what the Ukrainians understand by ceasefire is not the same thing that Americans would speak to policymakers in Washington understand, and it's not the same thing that policymakers in Brussels understand as ceasefire. They really have different kind of views of what that period would look like and what it would mean. I think that part of our author practitioner views here or interest would be to try to bridge some of the misunderstanding here, if at all possible, from our limited academic influence.
Thank you all. We have one more question that I'd like to share with both of you, with all three of you actually. What effect will expansive, unrestrained capitalism, both private and national, have in remaking transatlantic cooperation and shaping the growing wave of nationalism around the world?
I think I think that's such an excellent question, because it gets back to this whole point of tension between the requirements for domestic legitimacy and the requirements for international cooperation. And when I say this requirements for domestic legitimacy, what we should know is that nationalism is just a formula for the domestic legitimation of state institutions. And it's one formula among many, and we can legitimate state institutions in nationalist terms, and often do legitimate state institutions in nationalist terms by asserting a positive but also a negative identity, right? We are this group and we're not that group, and this group is the group that should control the institutions. What's happened is that in a very tragic way, the commitment to a globalized world economy left a significant group of people behind, and exposed them to risks for which they were unprepared, and to relative changes in status for which they had no narrative to explain, and felt like they were being abandoned. And this is true both in Europe and in the United States. This unrestrained capitalism that Lee talks about is that form of globalization. That wasn't meant to be the way it was supposed to work. The original post-World War II formula was this compromise of embedded liberalism, where states were supposed to intervene to prevent this from happening, to bind people together and to legitimate their existence through the welfare state. But it did take place in the period after the end of the Cold War, tragically, because we reformed welfare states in order to achieve greater competitiveness, and lost people along the way. And their belief in the legitimacy of this arrangement waned as a consequence. And what we have are now a group of politicians that are using identitarian politics like nationalism to offer a different framing. And part of the reason for the Biden administration's foreign policy for the middle class was to overcome that. Part of the reason that we have this whole debate in Europe about the Letta and Draghi reports and the need for competitiveness and a better functioning internal market is to overcome that. But the most important report to read coming out of the European Union right now is the one by former Finnish President Sauli Niinisto about security and resilience, because what Niinisto argues is that we will never be secure if we do not restore the trust of the people in public institutions like the state, but also the European Union and NATO. And what he says, and this gets directly to Paul's point, is that part of securing the trust of people in NATO is making sure that Europeans can provide for their own defense. Can't ask other countries to defend you if you can't defend yourself as well. And so I think the Europeans are waking up to this in a way that would overcome the thrust of Lee's question, which is really about whether we can ever overcome this nationalism. But to do so requires a tremendous exercise of political will. Just read the preface of Ninisto's report, the part that he wrote himself, and what you see is his appeal to that kind of political will, and hopefully we'll see that manifest.
I think that it's important to also look at some of the great monsters, if I can call them, that came out of capitalism, and also the differences between how the important wealth that is accumulated by some of these people is being used in different ways in the United States and in Europe. In Europe, the richest men and women are involved in fashion. And probably when they get together, they don't plan on annexing or buying some other country. In the United States, when the richest people get together in Palo Alto over a burger or whatever, they have different kinds of interests. And I think that this is also an important imbalance in the way that some of the results of capitalism have shown that they can move Europe and United States in different directions, and also find them in very conflictual areas, because even the uber rich seem to not agree on what they want to do with their wealth, and so I mean there's so much disorder coming also at the top, and this really creates a lot of space for us to ask more interesting questions of how even these people are talking amongst themselves, and what effects their decisions will ultimately have on our tax system, on what our politicians decide to create as tax benefits, and where to extract more wealth, and for whom to create policy as well. I think that that's also a source of great concern.
The only thing I'd add is that in the United States, as we look at the incoming administration, not only will we see examples of what Veronica just mentioned, of the uber rich not necessarily agreeing among themselves on what they really want, but if you look more broadly at what Donald Trump considers his constituency, and looking at people who have Donald Trump's ear or believe they have his ear, there are all kinds of differences that have yet to be ironed out between the uber rich backers and his populist working class constituency. I doubt very much that the incoming president has resolved much of any of this in his own mind, and I think we're going to be seeing a lot of internal battles on these various questions inside Washington.
Thank you all. And as you all continue to pursue these very big questions, my hope is that you will keep Political Science Quarterly in mind, yet again, for future submissions. On behalf of the journal, I want to thank both of our authors for submitting this article to us. And I want to thank all three of you, Eric, Veronica, Paul, for being here with us today, and Paul for your service as a member of PSQ's editorial board for quite a few years. Thank you for serving the journal in that capacity as well. I am very pleased to have shared this screen with all of you for the past hour. We look forward to seeing more of your work, and thank you very much to our audience for being with us. And I hope that we could share a screen again as the questions continue to linger and as you continue to answer the questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Marilena. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Paul. It's been great being with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good
Thanks,
week.
everyone.